I want to thank you all to All Things Relative with Kathy Nielsen. Today we're going to talk about telling our family stories and jumping right in. Just like our previous programs, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Or if we'll have some time at the end, you can ask Kathy the questions. If not, I'll read them at the very end. And then I just ask that if everyone could please mute themselves while Kathy's presenting, just to try to limit the distractions. And then when we're finished, we can unmute and have a conversation.
Okay, can you see that?
Looks perfect.
Great, okay. So today we're going to talk about sharing your family stories. And this is a picture of my Aunt Tot. She's the second one on the right. And she is a school teacher in Hollister. Her name is LMA, and she would every year for my birthday and for Christmas, she would give me a book that was perfectly age appropriate. And I think she's the reason why I became a librarian. So her story is an important story, and I have the opportunity to tell her story. And as we talked about with photos a couple of months ago, those of you that were part of that discussion, photos are a good jumping off place to tell stories. So this picture of my LMA, my Aunt Tot, with her school teacher friends, I think is priceless. You can see that she has an impish little grin, and she was very much like that. She was a lot of fun. So in telling our stories, we just need to jump in and do it and not have excuses. My son said to me one day, I was saying, oh, I've got so many stories to tell, I need to write them down. He says, Mom, would you just stop whining? Would you just jump in and do it? And that was a number of years ago, and I've been having fun just jumping in and doing it. So I'm going to share with you some of the stories that I have written about, and to give you some ideas about stories you might want to write about. This is a picture of the Mitchell Library. This is in Sydney in Australia. And in the lobby of the library is a big sign that says, all great stories lead back to us. And I love that, because not only is it the stories of our ancestors that lead back to us, but it's our own stories that we should be telling about our ancestors and about ourselves. So all stories really begin and end with us. And I hope today that I will give you some ideas about those stories that you might like to share as well. So stories last about 3 generations. And this on the right is a picture of myself and my daughter and my mother. And my daughter knows my stories. She's heard a lot of my stories, and she knows a lot of her grandmother's stories as well. But she doesn't know about her great-grandmother. So if I don't share those stories about her great-grandmother, she won't know them. And on the left-hand side is myself and my mother and my grandparents. And I know my mother's stories and I know my grandparents' stories, but Sarah doesn't. So it's really important that I share those stories. So today I'm going to share a couple of my family stories to get you started, and I'm going to share ways you can pass on your family stories. And it doesn't have to just be with written stories. It can be in other ways, and we're going to talk a little bit about that too. This is a Swedish great uncle who lived in Kingsburg, and this was his wife, Ellen, and they have a story. In fact, I've shared a little bit about him in some of our other talks. His name is Oscar. So all stories are important, and they're the stories about where are we from, and these are our stories too. Where have we been? What kinds of things have we overcome? Have there been some trials that we've faced in our lives? All of us have, and maybe we want to write about those. Why did we make the decisions that we did? Why did our ancestors make the decisions that they did? And do we have a special gift or a special interest that we want to share? What about our occupations, the things that we've done with our lives? Maybe those are of interest. And of course, our relationships with our family and our friends and our neighbors and business associates, those are all stories too. They say that, and this is Steve Rockwood, he is one of the executives with Family Search. We'll talk a little bit about Family Search in our next time we're together. But Steve Rockwood says, the children who have a strong sense of family history are more resilient than those who don't. And I think that's because they've heard the stories of how their families have survived. They've heard about things that their families have experienced and gone through. And they know if their mom and dad, their grandparents can handle this, they can too. So I think it's really important that we share not only the stories, the happy stories, but some of the stories that have been challenges as well. And I think it's important that our children hear these stories. So as genealogists, many of you have created a pedigree chart, and I consider this the hanger. This is what has the birth, the marriage, the death dates, and the place where your ancestors lived. But it's just a hanger. For me, the interesting thing about these people are the stories. That's what makes them real. That's what makes them come to life. And this is a pedigree chart of my mother, Sarah Monroe. She's there, number 1, and you can see her parents are 2 and 3, and then her grandparents and so forth. So this just gives us a starting point, but this isn't the story. This isn't the meat of their lives. And that's what we're going to talk about. This is called a fan chart. Again, my mother's in the center, and I have one for my dad as well. And you can see I've got a lot of holes. There's a lot of families that I have not researched. But every one of those colored boxes has a story. And we can find out that story. It's easiest if it's 3 generations, but we can go back and we can put together the story of these people's lives, even 5, 6, 7, 8 generations back, just basically looking at what was happening in the towns where they lived at that time and putting together an idea of what their lives were like. So where do you start? How do we do this? Well, I start with the story that interests me. I'm not going to write about something that doesn't interest me. So if there's something that kind of piques my interest, a story maybe my mother told me, that makes me want to explore it further. And maybe I just want to build on it and I want to see if it's true. I've found a lot of stories that I have heard. I found there were little variations. My mother loved to tell stories and she added this and that. And some of it isn't quite the way it actually came down, but it was a starting point and it was fun for me to research and figure out how these things, how this story came about. And it's good to begin with a story that you've done some research or you know a little bit about. And then you might want to incorporate into your story photos that you have and perhaps family heirlooms even to talk about them. Do you remember when we talked that last time we met, I talked about the trunk that is in my family that my mother used to say came across the isthmus, but in actual fact, it wasn't created until the 1880s. So it couldn't have come across the isthmus, but it makes a great story. So I'm going to start with a story of one of my ancestors. And this is John Willis Green. And John Willis Green was born in the early 1800s. He came from Michigan and he came out to California in 1850 with the gold rush. And he left his wife and my grandmother in Michigan with her in-laws. And he came out for a year and he hoped to make it rich. He was a young man in his 20s and it didn't go that way. He came out, checked it out, and he went back. But to tell this story, I don't necessarily have to have a picture of John Willis Green. I can get pictures from other sources. This is one from the internet, and he is not in this picture, but these are miners that were in the Nevada City area where he is. Now, I want to give credit for that, but nevertheless, that can embellish your story a bit. And here we have miners with the sluice box. The sluice box, which allowed water and materials to come down through a channel, and then the gold would be trapped by little dividers that were in the sluice box. And then they could take that gold out and they could pan for gold. Well, this is all part of his story. I don't have this written down. He is my 2 times great grandfather, but I can put together something that might have been his story. Now, he had a daughter, and you may have seen this picture before. This is my great-grandmother, Emma Sarah Monroe, and her husband, Daniel Monroe. This is Daniel Monroe on the side. This is his daughter, the daughter that he left for a year when he went off to, I should say that he did come back to California, and he did do very well with the gold rush. In between his, he had a birth of one daughter, had a birth of a second, came back to California and had two more daughters. Anyway, Emma Sarah was about 18 when she married Daniel Monroe. And Daniel Monroe was a lawyer from Albany, New York, or went to law school with William McKinley. He came back to Michigan to marry his sweetheart. And he told his father-in-law, John Willis Green, that he was moving to California and he was going to set up his law firm in San Francisco. And John Willis Green, who had been to California twice and had made some money with the gold rush, thought, oh, now John Willis Green was only in his 40s at this time. He said, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to sell my brick factory, and I'm going to sell some of my property, and I'm going to bring my two teenage girls and my other married daughter who had married a Union veteran, and we're going to join you. And so the 8 of them took a train from Michigan to the East Coast, boarded a steamship, and came down the coast to Panama and crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and then boarded a steamship and came up to San Francisco. And that was in 1868. Now, I haven't heard this story I've heard bits of this from my mother, but by going back in and researching parts of it, I can put together the story of their life. They lived in San Francisco. That is my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather. And they had a baby, Fanny, who sadly died in an early age. My great-grandfather, his law office was in Broadway in 1860, and this is the way Broadway looked. This is what he would have walked down to work with. This is the bustling San Francisco, which was, of course, was doing so well because it was after the gold rush, and the marina had been extended with the ballast from the ships and the ships that were in the harbor. San Francisco was bustling. I wanted to know where Daniel and Emma Sarah lived. So I went to directories. That's a really good source to track your ancestors. And I saw that Daniel Monroe lived at 606 Washington, and his law firm, which was Snow, Monroe, and Fifield, was on Sacramento, 636 Sacramento. By the way, Snow and Fifield went to law school with him. And that's that whole thing about researching the ancestors, the business associates and the fan club to get more information. So they have a story as well, those two people he started his law firm with. So he would have come down Montgomery, probably walked to work. I was kind of curious about how far where he lived and how far he had to go to work. You see, he's up there at 606 Washington Street, and his office was at 636 Sacramento. And those of you that know San Francisco, that's Montgomery with the blue dots and Kearny with the gray line. So he could have either come down Montgomery, which would have looked like this in the 1860s with the horse-drawn streetcars and the buggies, or he could have come down Kearny. So I'm already getting a feel for what his life was like. Now, meanwhile, John Willis Green has settled in Hollister, and he has sold his land in Michigan, and he's got a little bit of money, and Hollister is starting to grow at this time. Hollister has bought the San Justo Rancho, or has parts of the San Justo Rancho. So he's divided it up into lots. And John Willis Green has bought one of those lots and is farming 3 miles outside of Hollister. This is a book that's called the Mug Books. The Mug Books are in many of our local libraries, certainly in Monterey, but any local library where your ancestors lived probably have a mug book. They were the who's who of the late 1800s. And they were called a mug book because they often had a picture of the person. And a person would pay to have their picture or their something about them in the books generally. So anyway, he was in this book. And in this book was a picture of his farm. the Springbrook Farm near Hollister. Now, of course, it looks wonderful. So he had someone come and sketch it and draw it, and it looks like, you know, he was quite prosperous. Those are the Gavilon Mountains in the background. So this is what was in the book. J.W. Green is a pioneer of the state, having crossed the mountains in 1850. He endured many hardships on the journey, walking the entire distance from Joliet, Illinois to Sacramento in 5 months. That's quite a feat to begin with. His search for gold was not successful, and he returned east the following year. But not satisfied with the change, he returned, and in the winter of 1852 and 53, mined in Nevada City for 13 months, and he made $6,500, which is about $230,000 today. So he did pretty well. And then he returned to Michigan. And this is in one of those mug books. Also, there was other things, description of his silos on his farm. There was a lot of information about him. So be sure and see if your 1800s ancestors are in one of these books. They're called biographical sketches, but they've been called mug books. Okay, let's keep going here. Go back. It looks like I'm not. Okay. You know how I like to keep a timeline? I've talked about how that is. Well, this is a timeline for Daniel and Emma. So in 1871, they're still in San Francisco, but it looks like Daniel has become very, very tired, maybe, I don't know, burned out or whatever, but he and Emma decide to move to Hollister to be with the in-laws and with her parents. Her sisters are all there. They have family. Her sister has just lost a child as well. And they decide to be with them. So they move down to Hollister. And this, again, is all plotted by census and directories. I'm able to see where they went. In 1875, he was a sheep raiser in Peachtree. That's outside of Hollister. And that I saw in a directory. And he worked with Jesse D. Carr and David Jacks. Now, many of you have heard of these two. They are were land developers, and you know, there's been a lot of question about some of the things that they did. But in any case, he worked with both of them. He was a county supervisor from 1877 to 1880, and that would be fun to go into the notes. I haven't done this, but I could do this and see what issues were being discussed at that time. I know water was an issue even then in 1870s. And then in 1885, he became foreman of the Peachtree Ranch outside of Hollister, and that was owned by Miller and Lux. And I could go in and look more into Miller and Lux. Miller and Lux were cattlemen who, butchers from Germany, who had bought land all up and down the valley, Las Vegas, outside Salinas, King City, and they raised cattle and sold their cattle, their meat, to the miners, and they became very wealthy. Anyway, he was a foreman of one of their ranches. And then he moved to Washington. Not sure why, but I know Lux died, and I know there was some kind of concern about who owned the land, and water was an issue. So maybe he decided to leave that. Didn't have a successful year in Washington. He came back to Castorville. They were in Hollister again, and then they moved to San Francisco as their children got jobs in San Francisco. This is a family photo from the Peachtree Ranch. I don't know if that's a shed where the cowboys, the people on the ranch lived, but you can get an idea. Here's some of the ranch hands. Here they are threshing, cutting wheat. And this is my grandfather and his, on the left, and his older brother, Jim. And I don't know if this is one of the ranch hands' houses or their house, but in any case, my grandfather was raised on the ranch. Now, this grandfather married my grandmother, who is the Peachtree Ranch story that some of you were with me when I talked about the Peachtree Ranch. And when I did Every Home Has a Story. So they later linked up. She was in Prunedale, he was in Hollister. They later met through one of his sisters. When the family came back from Washington after an unsuccessful stint at raising wheat, they lived in Castorville. And this house is still there, and the people who own it have just kept it up so beautifully. They rented this house. It was owned by one of the Castro family, and it's still there. And my grandfather took the train into Monterey and went to Colton Hall, which was a school. Now, see, each of these is a story in itself, and I could develop that. I did go over to Colton Hall looking to see if he was on the class rosters. They have incomplete records, but the story is that he did indeed go to Colton Hall. And this is Hollister at that same time, Monterey Street and Hollister, when they all were living in Hollister. Now, LMA, who I started out with, the school teacher, she's on the right there. This was her school in Hollister. And on the left, I'm not sure where that building or schoolhouse is, but she also taught in Tres Pinos, and that might be a building there. I'd like to figure that one out. In any case, she has a story as well. That's my grandfather on the left in the upper left. And then they moved to San Francisco, and I've shared this picture before. They lived in a duplex on Lincoln Way, and they were there in 1906. And of course, they were there during the earthquake and the fire. And this is from a stereoscope, which was a kind of a 3D viewer, and you could put this in your little scope that you could look at, and it would be three-dimensional. So anyway, that's the earthquake, the damage. They had to cook out on the street because the gas was all turned off. And in fact, my great-grandfather wrote to his family, which would have been the in-laws and his sister-in-laws and his father-in-law. The quake was terrible, but the fire was even worse. It is too dirty cooking out in the street on a campfire. You know, we have no gas yet, but last night we could have lighted a candle until 10 p.m. The quake broke all of Daisy's pretty dishes, except those she had on the table. Our mantle was twisted off, fell against the table, broke a vase of flowers. Daisy is a daughter-in-law. And here they are in their later life, 60s, 70s, in the backyard of their San Francisco home. So I do have a story there. So how did I get this story? Well, I certainly went to the Big Four, which are the online databases, which we will be talking more about: Ancestry, Family Search, Find My Past, My Heritage, and Heritage Quest. And I also went to Google, and I went to other places. And I went to the census, and I went to the directories and the voter registration. I went to newspapers and periodicals, obituaries, maps, autobiographies, memoirs, historical fiction, local histories, the mug books that we talked about, and secondary sources, and of course, photos. So I searched online, and I went to the library for these different sources to make my story come together. And one of the things I discovered, I just love this discovery. This was from Heritage Quest, and this is a voting roster. Now, the registration tells you often the occupation, the address, and the party that the family is signed up for, what they're going to vote for. Now, in California in 1912, women had the right to vote. So California was a little ahead of the rest of the country. And so I was interested to see where all my great aunts were as they signed up to vote, and where my great grandfather was signed up. So here's the family. The people running in the election were Taft. He was a Republican, and he was running for a second term. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. He was on the ballot. Theodore Roosevelt was with the Bull Moose Party, and this was a progressive party, a third party, which took a lot of votes away from the Republican Party as a result. And then Eugene Debs was with the Socialist Party. So here's the way this worked out with the family. William Manley was an elevator builder. And of course, he was doing very well because San Francisco was rebuilding after the earthquake. They all lived on Lincoln Way in a duplex. He was at 1041 Lincoln Way. He registered as a socialist. Now, he probably was with a union of elevator builders. And so very likely he was sensitive to this and registered as a socialist. Daisy Monroe was a housewife. She was married to a banker, and she's registered as a Democrat. She's in 1039 Lincoln Way, which is the duplex next door. Ella May, who's my school teacher, is a teacher. She's registered as a Democrat. She's living there. They're all living together. Annie Pearl is married to William Manley. And William Manley is the elevator builder. So she's registered as a socialist as well. Hattie, or Harriet Monroe, is a seamstress, a tailorist with the city of Paris in downtown San Francisco. And she's signed up as a progressive. She, at this point, is intending to vote for Theodore Roosevelt. And Daniel Monroe, the patriarch, my great-grandfather, who is retired, is signed up as a Republican. Emma Sarah has not signed up. Maybe she's just not ready to vote. They would be in their 60s at this point. So I just chuckle when I think about what the dinner conversation would be like with this family, probably like some of our conversations in the last couple of years. So that was really interesting information. I don't know how they voted, but that's how they registered. So the newspapers, Monterey Public Library and public libraries all over the country often have digitized their newspapers. But if they haven't, you can always call up the librarian. The librarian will do searching for you all over the country. So take advantage of that. Anyway, Monterey has, from 1846 to 1964, has signed up, has digitized the local newspaper. And I did find two articles about Daniel Monroe. One was really showed his address, San Lucas post office box. He was just using as a witness for this man who wanted to approve that he lived where he did. But this showed me that Daniel Monroe in 1888 was using the San Lucas post office box, which shows me he was at the Peachtree Ranch. So he'd come in and get his mail in San Lucas. So that was a really important thing for me to find. And then this is about his death, and his sister-in-law left for San Francisco on that early train yesterday to attend the funeral of her brother-in-law, who was stricken with a severe stroke of paralysis. I didn't know that he was paralyzed for a year and had a stroke. And so that was information there. So now these other sources, original sources and secondary sources, the Shirley letters is a letters captured about Nevada City, which would tell me more about what the mining was like. This book is about the 1906 earthquake. That would give me some background information. These are all things that can put flesh on those hangers, on those pedigree charts that we talked about. Some of you may have been read Laura Ingalls Wilder or read those to your children. The Long Winter is about 1880 in the Dakota Territory, where my Swedish family went to. And she describes what it was like in the Dakotas in 1880. The trains couldn't get through. They didn't have food. They were snowed in. They were boiling, bark off trees to make kinds of soup. It was a very, very hard winter in the Dakotas. And my family was there in the 1880. So that really gave me a sense of how hard it must have been for them, having just immigrated from Sweden. The Checkered Year is a farm diary of the Dakotas, also 1884 to 1888. These are the things that can give you more information and can add to your story. And of course, photos add to the story. They help develop the setting, and they lend insights into the people, into your people, what they're wearing, what they're eating, what their occupations are, if they have military uniforms on. These are all things that can add to that story. This is a photo that I love that I think has quite a story, and I don't know exactly why. This is a Swedish group in Kingsburg, and that's my great-grandfather on the steps in his Swedish farm outfit, and that's my grandfather to the left. Now, why are they not standing together? And that's an interesting story right there. My grandfather was a realtor, a farm commercial realtor, and he was dressed as a realtor would be, in a suit and a bowler hat. And my great-grandfather is in his farm clothes. The other part of this story is that my great-grandfather, was a farm worker in Sweden, an itinerant farm worker, comes to California, and he has this house, and he's got his barn, and he's got he just had built this house. So you can see there's not a lot of vegetation, but he did have his grapes and his apricots, and his is a story, an amazing story. So not only your photos that you may be lucky to have, but be sure and go to Google and Flickr and Wikipedia and the Internet Archive and the Library of Congress and Calisphere, which is sponsored by the University of California. These all have historical photos that you can use. You want to give credit to them. But check out the copyright status. If they're public domain, if they're before 1925 and the copyright has not been renewed, by giving credit to them in your book, you certainly can use them. They're before 1925. So if they're public domain issues, you can. The Creative Commons license also will give specific rights to users, and that you can find with Wikipedia, often has that. You can search for Creative Commons licenses. Those will be photos that you can use. So those are just some tips. So it's time to jump in. You have your pedigree chart, you've got an idea, you have some family photos, maybe. You've researched an ancestor, and maybe you have a story in mind. And now is the time to share that story and present it in some format that might appeal to your family. It doesn't have to be in a book, but in some way. Now, we've all got excuses. Like I had excuses when I was sharing this with my son. I'm not a writer. I can't do this. This is just too much work, It's too hard. I just can't do this. I don't have enough information. How can I write something when I don't have any information? I'm not finished with my research. I've got to do this. We could research to the end of our lives. We all know that. So you're never going to finish with your research. At some point, you just have to say, I got to do it. And lastly, I just don't know where to begin. Okay, let's tackle some of these excuses. Maybe you don't have to write that book. Maybe you can just do a family tree. I mean, that's a wonderful gift to your family. There's a company called Family Chart Masters, which makes beautiful family trees, and you can design it with them, and you could frame it, and that could be your gift. That's great. I mean, you've done that. You could do a book. Now, I like the idea of a book because technology changes, and we create something on our computers, and it's not going to be around. And I feel that if I do a book, my kids aren't going to throw it out. Mom did this book, we'll keep it. They may not necessarily want to read it, but they're going to keep it. So a book appeals to me, and there are different ways we can do that. But you might want to do a blog or a website, and that's really helpful to connect with other cousins, because they'll do a search on Google, and they'll find that you've written something about a mutual ancestor. So a blog is a possibility if that's something that interests you. And then you can just do a scrapbook. Just put these things together in a scrapbook. I mean, that's good too. Or a photo album, where you've labeled some of the photos. That's wonderful. You're telling a story. The photo album tells the story. You might just want to interview a family member or even yourself and just transcribe it. So it's informal. You don't have to sit down and have complete sentences, etc. It can be as you speak. You might want to just transcribe an interview that you have, or a diary, or a journal. You might want to write a poem. If you're creative and artsy and craftsy, you might do a shadow box or collage. Maybe you're a quilter. Maybe you like to embroider. And maybe you want to do a slideshow. Just put your pictures together in a slideshow. So you can tell your story in lots of different ways. And one of these might appeal to you, might seem like something that something you'd like to do. Okay, so this is how you do it, or at least this is how I do it. Select your ancestor. Choose that ancestor that you're drawn to. Choose one that you've researched a little bit. And choose one about whom you've gathered a few personal memories, perhaps. It might be easier to start with a grandparent or someone that you did know. And begin with one sentence. John Willis Green was born in 1824 in Augusta, New York. Well, I can take that and I can say, what was happening in America in 1824? And I can see what I can find out about Augusta or Oneida County. I can check newspapers. There's lots of newspaper databases. I can add a few details there. And maybe I can explore why his father was there. Actually, his father was a veteran of the War of 1812, and many of the veterans were given land in upstate New York. So that's why his family was up there. But that's a backstory that I can incorporate as well. I can check the census, and I can track the movements, the migration of a family. I can see what their occupations are and where they lived. I can see if there were brothers and sisters. I can talk about that. I can see if the family stayed in Augusta or did they move. Actually, because of the 1840 census, I know they moved to Michigan, Livingston County. And then I can look at, what was Michigan like in 1840? Well, Michigan was quite rural and lots of farms. And at this point, New York was getting more established. So they were moving west, where things were a little bit more rural. And did he marry? Did he have children? And why did he go to California? The whole gold rush story. And what was happening in 1870 census, and how did he end up in Hollister, and what was happening in Hollister? These are all these things that I can look up and find out more information about, and I can incorporate this in my story. So one of your options is to self-publish a book. Of course, an option would be to find that perfect publisher who will put it together for you and becomes on the bestseller list. But if that's not an option, which of course it isn't for most of us, you can think about self-publishing it. And it can be a family history on one person or one family. One of the things that I've become interested in is just writing a vignette, which is just like a thought that comes to mind about my background or something that I lived or a story that I heard, and just writing a couple of pages together. And I have several of these, and my next project is to put this together in some kind of a book. Maybe just put photos together and label them, like using Shutterfly. I mean, that's amazing. Just the chronology of a family and labeling those pictures. Maybe you want to transcribe ancestors' writings. And then there are ways that you can generate your book by genealogy software. And those of you that have a genealogy software can explore that further. So, publishing tools. There is a local publisher, Patricia Hamilton. I have met with her. She is in Pacific Grove. And this is a company, and there are many of these little local publishers. You might find a recommendation from a friend or someone else, but what her company does is they will help you with a graphic design. They will help you edit it. They will help you with the layout. So if this is like overwhelming to you, this is someone that can help you take you through the process. So that is one option. Another are these online publishing tools. Lulu is one that I've used. They do a beautiful job. Shutterfly, many of you have probably used that with photos, and that you can have text in that. You can lay that out. These companies will have templates, so you don't feel like you have to graphically design it from scratch. Blurb is another beautiful one, beautiful reproduction of photos. Kindle Direct Publishing is the new Amazon one. It used to be called Creative Spaces, but it's now called KDP, and then Ingram Spark. Okay, this is a friend who put a book together. Her name is Robin Ashleyman, and Patricia Hamilton helped her with this, and it just turned out beautiful. I'm looking for my glasses. Okay, I want to just write what she wrote about it. I wrote a book. It wasn't something I planned to do. It just sort of wrote itself. There we were at the camp table at the Lake of Memories, a summer outing for the last 42 years. My husband across from me, chin resting on his chest. No internet, no phone, no kids. June 2015. The drought heavy upon us, the lake low. Too old to walk way, way, way down to the diminished lake's edge. And oh dear, too hot to even try. We needed a break from doing nothing, a distraction from the heat. I don't know where the words came from. Tell me the story of walking on trees. And he did. iPad and keyboard in hand, my fingers whirled and the story unfolded. And when it ended and the memory was fresh, I corrected the typos and filled in the blanks and asked him to tell me another story. And he did. And this is the story of her husband. It's a beautiful book. So that was just something that spontaneously came up, and a book came out of it. Now, these are some other friends of mine that have written books. Jeannie Gold wrote about her daughter who has a disability and the process of growing up with her daughter. And it's a lovely book. She was in a writing class with me, and we would hear the different parts as she shared each chapter. My dear friend from elementary school, junior high, who's with us today, hi Barb, wrote a book about I'd Rather Have You Call Me William. She was a kindergarten teacher for 45 years, and she shares her stories of her students and the funny things that they did and said to her, and it's just delightful, and just really the joys of being a teacher. So Barbara, you did a great job on that. And this one, the McQueenies, is From Ireland to America as a Family History. So I did my book. My first book was The Journey from Frida to Kingsburg. And this is my brother. We're on the land of my great-grandfather Anders Petter Anderson in the Dakotas. And this is the journey of searching for his story, and then my own journey of connecting with cousins and telling that story. And this is Anders Petter and Fredrika Johansdotter, who came from Långsbratten in Sweden. I had the opportunity to go to Sweden and meet Swedish cousins, and ended up in Kingsburg with this 2-story house and his 1918 Dodge. The story of an immigrant who took advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862, took that land, sold it, and then came out to Kingsburg. And I used a photos template, which was connected with a map, but all of these sources that I showed you, you can do the same thing. And I laid out my pages, I laid out my text. I had an editor that went over and looked for typos and actually had some good suggestions about how to rearrange some things. I dedicated the book to my Swedish cousins who helped me find my roots, and to my brother. And I included the pedigree chart because there were a lot of people in this book, and I wanted people to know how they fit in. I talked about Castle Garden, how they came into Castle Garden on the steamship, how they took the train to the Dakota Territory, what their life was like on the prairie in Buxton, North Dakota, their deed, their land, their naturalization papers, the schools where, that's my grandfather in the bottom picture, the schools where the kids went in Kingsburg, the first house that my great-grandfather built, the second house, his car, and my Swedish cousins. So I put this story together, and then I gave this to some of my cousins because I wanted them to know the story of Anders Petter. And then my next books were about my husband's family, who is Australian. And we went to a couple of reunions, and I put these books together for the reunion crowd. In 2018, we were in Australia, and in 2020, we were in New Zealand. I updated it. And then another family, Australian family, I did another book. So I got into the swing of it, and it really isn't that difficult. Once you get into it, it's really fun. And of course, we've had a quiet year with COVID, and I was able to be a little bit more prolific than I might have been otherwise. So I focused on my books. But another idea is to actually take, and one of the people who's on today is something with her German ancestors, Margaret, transcribing her letters from her family. This is another friend whose granddaughter took her grandmother's letters and put them into a book and gave this to her grandmother. That is, her great-grandmother's letters, gave it to her grandmother. I thought that was just a great idea. She's got the actual diary there, and then she just transcribed it. Now, this book, this is a lovely book by Richard Rands. You may have heard him speak. He speaks locally. He's from the Silicon Valley. He's recently moved out of the Silicon Valley. But he wrote about Anna, his grandmother. And this is a lovely, delightful little book about her 20th year in 1918. Of course, this is the year of the war and the flu. And she was in Salt Lake City. She starts out in 19 years old to 20, She's going to parties. She's having fun with the sailors that are in, or the soldiers that are in town getting ready to be shipped out overseas. She's making herself pretty dresses. She has a job. By the end of the year, we see how she's growing up. We see what's happened with the war. We see how she's writing to friends that are fighting in the war. She's lost people with the flu. Richard has taken this diary and he's annotated it with what's happening at the time she writes it. And he talks about, if she goes to the movies, he talks about that movie. If she is meeting with friends or relatives, he talks a little bit of the background of those friends. So this is a labor of love, and it is available on Amazon, and it's really a sweet book. Another friend, Jennifer, who is with our off the charts group, which is our writing group, did one on postcards from a family member. I'm not sure if this is her grandmother or not. She actually scanned these postcards and told the story of Emma through the postcards. And she did this with Amazon. And it's a lovely book. It's really amazing. So now vignettes. Okay, the vignettes that I've written that I'm going to put together in this book are Contested Wheel and Stolen Bible, When the Grave Sings, One Decision Changed Two Lives. These are all just like 2 pages. It all started with one parakeet. 10 Things My Mother Taught Me, the red Volvo station wagon 240 DL. I love that car. I love that car. Maybe some of you had that. And my experiences with the DMV. So I'm going to put this, I've got quite a few of these. I'm going to put this together in a book. And that might be a way. Maybe you just want to write just 2 pages, put it aside, write 2 more pages of something else. And that way, I don't see myself as writing the register book of 1620 to 2020 of all my family. But I do see myself doing it in bits and pieces. And that might appeal to you as well. Now, this is a cousin who's done a blog that's online. And I've linked up with her through her blog. And she's telling the story of a mutual ancestor on her blog. That might be something that might appeal to you, those of you that are interested in the technical process of this. And she's written about, he was a loyalist and went to Canada. She's written about this. Now, I had the opportunity to see the land where he lived, and I sent her this picture, and she incorporated that in her blog. My father-in-law kept a scrapbook, which is just invaluable to us. This is a great-grandfather in the lower left corner and a grandfather who fought in World War I. And he has clippings from World War I. I mean, these are, these need to be scanned because, as we've talked about, in terms of newspaper clippings, they do disintegrate. But this is, maybe you just want to do a scrapbook, a photo album. That might be a way to share your story. Might just want to interview yourself. If you don't want to really write it down, just tape yourself telling the story, or tape a family member. Of course, with Christmas coming up, this is a chance to be with other family members. One friend said, and I thought this was a great idea, is record yourself on Zoom. Create your whole story by sharing it on Zoom and then putting in a photograph here and there, and then sending that off to people. I thought that was a great idea now that we're all getting to be adept at Zoom. And Storyworth, which is a company, maybe you've read about this, it's a company that you subscribe to. Every week they send you a question that you may not have thought about, a prompt in a way. And you can write or record the story. You don't have to even write it. You can just tell the story, like what was the first automobile that you owned? What was your first job? Your first love? Write or record a story based on that question. And then at the end of the year, they bind this together in a book. I mean, this is great. They do the work for you. All you have to do is just tell the story, record it. So that might be something to look into. You might be a poet. I wrote a poem based on George Ella Lyon. I am from California, golden coastal hills, oak trees, fields of lupin and poppies. And I just talked a little bit about my life. I think I'm going to use this at the beginning of my vignettes that I'm going to put together. And if you're crafty, a shadow box. This is my Prunedale grandmother. This was her slate at the Prunedale school. My mother made a quilt for me of all the dresses that I sewed, so I can remember these various dresses I sewed when I was growing up. And maybe you want to do a slideshow. Just create a one-sentence title. Select a few photos that demonstrate who, what, where, when, and why. Create a one-sentence caption. Just put it together and send it off on a flash drive to your cousins. Keep your slideshow short, though. You don't want to tire everyone out. So when I got back from Australia, I did do a little slideshow that I wanted to send to the cousins in Australia, just to let them to know how much it meant to us. So this is a little bit 3-minute slideshow.
I have fond memories of tow-headed cousins, hot valley summers, Swedish meatballs, my grandmother's warm apple pie, the sound of crickets, and great aunts and uncles sitting in lawn chairs, sharing stories in their mother tongue. I was raised in the midst of a large Swedish family. My cousins lived in small towns stretching from Turlock to Kingsburg. I lived in the suburbs of the East Bay and delighted in visiting my San Joaquin Valley family. My family immigrated to California 4 generations ago and put down roots. Bob does not have the same sense of family as I do. His family lives nearly 8,000 miles away in Australia and New Zealand. His ancestors made their way from Denmark to Scotland, to New Zealand, to Australia, to America. He does not have the same sense of place, of 4 generations of family living in one country as I do. So apart from immediate family, he has been separated from his tribe. My family's story is one of finding its place in California. Bob's family story is one of separation, of moving on, always searching for a better life. So in February 2018, Bob and I, our 2 adult children, Bob's sister and our nephew, made a trip to Bob's homeland to attend a family reunion. This would be an opportunity to share with our children their dad's story and his roots. We visited the houses where my husband lived, the schools he attended. He entertained us with stories of his childhood, the magpie that attacked him one morning on his way to school, the frilled lizard who bit his toe when he was hiking barefoot in the bush, the time he ran home to share with his mother that he could now read. We connected with the descendants of his Danish great-grandfather and his New Zealand great-aunts and uncles. And so 50 cousins from Wellington, Perth, Adelaide, Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne arrived to honor the Nielsen family and Bob's remaining uncle. 4 generations and 5 countries later, our California family connected with his family, the family that Bob had said goodbye to nearly 60 years ago. Yes, my husband is now truly an American citizen. He has lost his accent and has spent most of his life in America. But he is still an Australian, and we delighted in hearing that accent return. Part of my husband will always be Australian, and part will remain American. I think that that is the bittersweet situation for all immigrants. We were pleased to join him on this journey, and in the process, his family became our family. But maybe it was that way all along.
So that was something that I put together. It did take a little bit of time, but I wanted the family to know how much we appreciated the wonderful time we had. So my final tips to you are to find support for your project. You don't have to do it alone. Take an online writing class if that's something that you want to learn about. Find a local writing group. Create your own support group. I took a class from Lisa Alzo. That's what got me started about 5 years ago. You may have heard her speak. She does speak at different genealogical conferences, and that just got me going. And her program is called The Right Stuff. And then I decided that I needed to do something local. And maybe some of you know about Aaliyah Thompson. She teaches a memoirs class at the Carmel Foundation. And she's really a proponent of vignettes. She says, don't get bogged down with the great American novel or your own autobiography. Just write little vignettes, and that will get you started, sort of to get your muscles going. And we had an exhibit at the Monterey Public Library, which was really fun to do. And we had one at the Carmel Foundation. But if that isn't quite what you want, create your own group. There's a group of us, and there are some on today, who are involved in Off the Charts. And we call ourselves Off the Charts because we're telling the stories. We're not focusing on the charts so much. We're telling the stories of those charts, of the pedigree charts, of the fan charts. And we're sharing them not just in a written form, but in a picture form, all kinds of different ways. And this has really been great for all of us because it's got us to do things we wouldn't necessarily do. We're getting ideas from each other. We meet once a month, and any of you are welcome to join us. In fact, next Wednesday is our next meeting. We meet on Wednesdays, the second Wednesday of the month, at our third Wednesday, 1:30 to 3:30. We're going to be talking about our female ancestors. This is my aunt taught, my school teacher aunt. So if that interests you, please email me and I'll send you the link and you can join us. So the important thing is that you share your project with your family. Get your project out there, whatever it is. If it's just a tape of yourself, if it's a transcription, if it's a slideshow, put it on a flash drive, put it in the mail and get it out to your family because you don't want these precious stories to be lost. Deborah Abbott, I love this quote. Facts get recorded, stories get remembered. So what's your story? And I think we all have a story, not only our story, but the story of our ancestors. So my advice to you is just jump right in and share those precious family stories. Don't let them be forgotten. Okay, so next month, we're going to talk about some of those free online resources. These are the things that are the nuts and bolts of our story. These are what we find out about our ancestors so that we then can put it together in story form. And so we're going to talk about that next month. And that would be January 13th at 4 o'clock on Thursday. And in the meantime, Sean is at the library ready to answer any questions that you have on anything, not just necessarily Monterey. And I am available. You can contact me through Gmail, and I really look forward to hearing from you. So I hope you have some questions. I'm going to stop sharing now. And Sean, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. Right now, I'd like to open it up to the floor. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or type them into the chat box and I can read them out loud. We have a couple comments in the chat. They're very wonderful people. Sarah's hair is beautiful. That was a beautiful tribute to your husband's heritage.
Thank you.
Kathy, every time I see your short video, it moves me to tears.
Thank you, Gail. That's part of the joy of this whole journey that we're all on to discover the stories of our ancestors is that we learn more about ourselves in the process, and we learn about who's impacted in our lives, and many people find out that if they're musicians and they see they have other musicians several generations back, or they're teachers and there's teachers that run in the family. It's really interesting what you discover about yourself, not only about your ancestors.
Karen, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I'm worried about the directories, Kathy. Does the each city have a directory just for their own city or county, or could I find records, let's say, of Monterey in our library here in Stockton?
Not likely, but many directories have been digitized. So we'll look at that with Heritage Quest, because Heritage Quest has a lot of directories. So or Ancestry or Family Search for that matter, you can often find your family online. But if not, some of the little towns which are not digitized, you can call or write or email the local library and they will look it up for you. And that's what Sean does a lot of, because the Monterey directories are not digitized, but we get a lot, the library gets a lot of requests from people. Can you search for my ancestor, because I believe he or she was living in Monterey at a certain time, and then Sean can go right to that directory. Sean, I think we go back to 1900, don't we? Something like that.
1906. 1905, 1906 is our oldest directory.
And another aspect of that are the voter registration, which are also in the Monterey Public Library. Voter registration gives often the address and an occupation. And that's another way of seeing the migration of your family through how and that's of course just the males in most cases, but that's really helpful as well.
Okay.
Did you have another question, Karen?
Yeah, it seems like our families jumped around a lot. And
you know,
on one side and then the other. Are we pretty typical of families of these early pioneers, you think?
I think people were looking for a better life. But I think what's really interesting, if we go into the local histories of our family, which are online, Internet Archive has a lot of local histories, and also you want to look at WorldCat. I mean, these are just all these tools that we have. If we see what was happening in the town, there may have been an outbreak of smallpox, or there may have been an economic decline of some kind, or there may have been a fire or whatever. That may explain one reason why our families picked up and moved on. War. So getting in touch with a local history of your area where your ancestors live can really answer some of your questions. Also, we can look at the draft in Europe. Some of our ancestors left Europe because they were being conscripted and they didn't want to be there. And also you can see that we did not have the same immigration to the extent during the Civil War. People were not coming to this country during the Civil War. But after the Civil War, we have a big immigration. You know, we've got Castle Garden and we're moving into Ellis Island. And putting things in historical context can answer a lot of questions for us. See, is there anything in chat there that?
No, there's no questions in the chat. Does anyone else have any questions before we wrap this up?
I do want to give kudos to Margaret, who's on. Margaret has been transcribing the letters of her family, her German family, and sharing that with us at Off the Charts. And it's been fascinating to hear the story of her father who was in the war. So if you have letters from your family, by all means, try and transcribe them or get them out there. So there are just so many, there's so many options that we have.
We have a question, Sandra.
Yeah, so Kathy, I've been working really solidly on part of my dad's family, and it's the part that my mom never got to, and they're immigrants from the Azores. So I've done a lot of research, found a lot of information, but it's always the why, like in trying to tell the stories, like, well, why did they go there? And I have done a lot of looking at newspapers and reading history of the area and stuff like that, but still, you don't really know. I mean, I just wish that somebody had a diary. That would be great. So what do you do with that? Like when, they were here and now they're there, like, why did they do that?
Well, sometimes we're just never going to know. But in the case of the Swedish ancestors, in 1862, there was the Homestead Act. And our family were they were migrants, they laborers, they moved from farm to farm and worked. And all of a sudden, they heard about this opportunity, probably from some who went before them, that the land was available. 160 acres of land was available free. And so this was certainly an incentive. And then there was this conscription, which was going on for the younger men in Sweden. The Azores, were they fishermen, Sandra?
No, they were
No.
farmers. They were sheep herders, and 3 of the brothers came to California and they moved to the Bakersfield, Delano area. They raised sheep like my great-grandfather and his brother went there, raised sheep for 4 years, and then gave up because of the predators, the grizzly bears, the coyotes. They weren't making any money. And so the brother stayed and became a farmer. And my great-grandfather went back to the Azores, got married, had 6 children, and then came back to the United States, got to New Bedford. He died, and then his family came out to California. And I'm not really sure, because they were in New Bedford for several years, why they were there, because I think the intention had always been to join the other brothers in California, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But I learned a lot about the Azores and why young men were trying to avoid the draft, because they didn't consider themselves part of Portugal, even though they were. They didn't want to go fight in wars for Portugal. So a lot of them joined whaling ships. So that was the oldest brother. That's what he did.
Well, you've got a story there, Sandra.
Yeah, I wrote up everything that I had discovered so far. It took about 12 pages. I went brother by brother, and then with my great-grandfather, his children, just what I had found so far. So I've gotten pretty far in it, but it's just kind of like, well, I don't know really why they did this, but then they did this.
But you can certainly share that possibly this could have been the case, or maybe, there's a little creative nonfiction in there, but you can certainly throw those possibilities out, and who knows, maybe down the road you will find out. But
yeah, it was really, I was very fortunate, because there was a family story about the sheep herding, and it had only been like this story. But then I found, somebody told me about this oral history at CSU Bakersfield, and one of the brothers' sons had recorded an oral history, and he talked about it. So it was great.
Fabulous. That's another reminder that university and historical societies do have information tucked away, which is not online necessarily. That's really great. Sandra, we'd love to hear your story at Off the Charts, if you ever feel like joining.
Yeah, I'd like to come to that. I think it would be great.
You'd fit right in. So
we have a couple more questions. Sorry, Patrick.
Yeah, hi. I have a document from my family that one of my ancestors was one of the earliest Anglo pioneers in California, and it's transcribed, and it looks like a first-person transcription of his story, or at least part of his journey to get here. But there are additions to it that reference other authors after the fact that corroborate or enhance some of the first-person part of it. And there's a lot of debate in historical areas about this journey that he took. I'm trying to authenticate this story, this transcription that I have, whether it's authentic or not, because it is adulterated by all this second person citations in it that kind of corroborate portions of it. Do you have any suggestions for where to send this to try and authenticate it?
well, first, what time period are we talking about?
1833.
1833. Oh my goodness, there was a lot of loose genealogical research done during that period, and it was very popular to have your family, to have someone to research it, and so that's a time period that you do want to check out. So you're wise to do that. Is the form you have in type it typed or is it in
It's
handwriting?
typed, yeah.
It's typed, and there's no signature. There's nobody who said who did it. Well, what I would do is I would contact, what area was he from? Where was he living?
I mean, where did he come from originally?
Well, where did they settle in the United States?
Well, initially they settled in Tennessee, and then they went to Missouri, and then they came out to California. And I mean, a bunch of the family came out across the West in the 1830s and
I'd
40s.
contact some of the local libraries or historical societies in these places where he lived and see if some of the things that are in that document are reflected in local histories, or the librarians or historians, archivists have something that would corroborate what the document you have. Yes, I would question that. Certainly would give you a lot of information, but I would follow up, and maybe even a university or a state library might be the place to go as well. Were there some events in this document that were stand out historically, like a war or?
Yeah, I have sent it to Bancroft, but I didn't get any response.
I'd go to the areas where he lived. I'd contact those libraries. They would be more likely to have something.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good luck with that.
All right. Karen, I see your question. Mary Jane, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, it's kind of quick. My mom was hospitalized when she was really little for a long time away from family in San Francisco. And the family grew up she grew up in Monterey. If I were to try to find hospital records from, say, 1920 or 1921 in the city, I don't know if there was a children's hospital, where would you send me first, Kathy?
Well, was it a public hospital or was it a private hospital?
It had to be, given the poverty that, my grandparents, from Robin Ashleyman's stories, that they were not people of means. I imagine it was a public hospital.
Okay, so that would be more, you'd have more options with a public hospital than a private hospital. I would contact the San Francisco Public Library.
Okay.
And see what they would say. But I have had good luck. I found some Ag News documents, because that was a state hospital in Sacramento at the state archives. And so sometimes public hospitals are on the state level. So you might try that too. They may have brought together other hospitals, but I'd start with the San Francisco Public Library.
Thank you.
And then Karen, and then Margaret, did you have a question?
Basically a comment. I just wanted to let everybody know, and Kathy know, that the OTC group has been helpful, very helpful, supportive.
And you've flown with it. You've taken it and flown. Karen, you're muted. You're muted again.
Karen?
Yeah, she's muted.
The phone was ringing right by me, so that's why I did that. A question about blogs. How do you find out if someone's researching your family? Is there a listing somewhere, or should I just Google?
Just Google, use the quotes around the name. You might want to try different options of the name with a middle name, with a middle initial, but you don't just want all the Johns on Google or all the Millers. You want to put quotes around John, and if you have a middle name, because Miller is a common name, you're more likely to move in. You might want to indicate that you're looking for family history. You don't want the John who's connected to an IT company in Silicon Valley. You want the one who's been researched, and also put his dates. 2 dots, 1760, 2 dots, 1801, so that you've identified the John Miller that you want. If you know a location, you can throw that in there too, and that will pull up a blog. That if your ancestor is mentioned in a blog, that should pull it up.
Okay, thank you so much. I never asked that before.
But be sure and use those quotation marks.
Okay.
Definitely the quotation marks help a lot. And one last question. I've always wondered about my father's political affiliation. He died in 1955. Where could I go to find voter registrations? I've never thought of that.
Yeah, that would be at the public library where your father lived. They very likely would have that. Monterey County there are some at the Monterey Public Library, but the Monterey County Historical Society has voter registration. And that's a really good source through the county. And because Monterey and San Benito were connected until 1874, it also includes San Benito County. So yes, and also voter registration is online too. We'll talk a little bit about that next month, how you can use Heritage Quest and Ancestry to check out voter registration, but not everything is digitized. So sometimes you've got to go the next step. You've got to go directly to the library.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy. So much information. And if you would like to rewatch this presentation or any of Kathy's previous presentations, they are all available on the Monterey Public Library's YouTube channel. So all of our recordings our programs are recorded. So there's so much information being passed around. Sometimes you got to watch them again. So please feel free to check those out. And special thanks to Kathy for doing this. And we hope to see everyone next month when we go over some online resources.
Great seeing you all. I hope you have a happy holiday. Thank you,
Happy
Sean.
holiday.
You too.
Thank you,
Kathy.
Sean. Love you, Kathy.